You found the thing you had to hide to survive. You were never supposed to be this aware, this intuitive, this different. So you learned early that being yourself was dangerous. You got quieter, duller, smaller. You apologized for taking up space. And somewhere deep inside, a part of you went into hiding, a part Jung knew well. This isn't about lost potential. This is about survival strategy. You didn't choose to hide your gift. Your psyche did it for you. It knew what the world does to people who shine too bright, who see too much, who feel too deeply. But here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. That hiding wasn't permanent. It was preparation. And if you're reading this now, it means the hiding is over. The child who could read emotional temperatures in rooms before they learned. Multiplication. Who knew when adults were lying before they understood what lying meant? Who felt everything everyone around them felt and thought that was normal until they realized nobody else did? That was you. And the world had no idea what to do with you. Jung documented this pattern across his clinical work spanning decades. Children born with what he called differentiated perception. Not better than others, just different. They processed reality through additional channels most people never develop. They saw patterns in behavior, felt shifts in energy, knew things without knowing how they knew, and every single one learned the same survival lesson: hide it or be hurt by it. Your family didn't have language for what you were, so they called you sensitive, dramatic, too much. Your teachers saw your insight as disruption. Your peers felt exposed by your presence and pushed you away. Nobody meant to damage you. They just didn't have the consciousness to hold what you naturally were. So your psyche made a decision. If I can't be seen safely, I won't be seen at all. Jung called this the concealment of the golden shadow. Most people only think of shadow as the dark parts we hide, our anger, our selfishness, our cruelty. But Jung knew we also hide our light, our intelligence, our power, our gifts. We push them down into the unconscious when we learn they threaten others. And yours went deep. You learned to dumb down your observations, to pretend you didn't notice what you noticed. You'd see someone struggling and instead of naming it, you'd stay silent. You'd feel the tension in a relationship and learn to ignore your knowing. You developed what Jung called protective blindness, the ability to unsee what you saw, to unknow what you knew, to unfeel what you felt. The cost was immediate: chronic fatigue from the energy it takes to suppress natural ability, depression from living disconnected from your truth, anxiety from the constant monitoring of how much of yourself was safe to show, physical illness as your body stored the stress of constant self-betrayal. You thought something was wrong with you. Jung knew something was wrong with your environment. But the psyche is smarter than we know. While you were learning to hide, it was also learning, cataloging, preparing. Every person who rejected your insight taught you about projection. Every family member who demanded you be smaller taught you about ego fragility. Every friend who couldn't handle your depth taught you about consciousness levels. You weren't just hiding, you were studying. Consider a case profile that illustrates this pattern perfectly. We see this dynamic clearly in the story of someone with highly differentiated intuitive perception who came to understand their gift only after years of suppression. This individual could walk into any room and immediately sense the psychological atmosphere. Who was lying? Who was in emotional pain? Who harbored secret resentments? They didn't choose this ability. It was simply how their nervous system processed information. But this gift created immediate problems. They couldn't engage in small talk because they saw through every social facade. They couldn't maintain friendships because people felt exposed and uncomfortable around them. They couldn't hold employment because their presence disrupted the unconscious agreements that keep groups functioning smoothly. What looks like social failure was actually perceptual overwhelm. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his clinical work. These individuals weren't failing at relationships. They were succeeding at perception in a world that punished accuracy. Their nervous systems detected micro-expressions that revealed true emotional states. They felt the energetic shifts when someone was lying. They sensed the collective tension that groups unconsciously agreed to ignore, and they paid the price for this awareness. The most painful part wasn't the isolation. It was the self-doubt. When everyone tells you your perceptions are wrong, you start to believe them. When your family insists you're imagining things, you question your sanity. When friends accuse you of being negative for naming obvious problems, you wonder if you're the problem. This is how differentiated perception gets pathologized. Not because it's inaccurate, because it's inconvenient. Jung saw this in his practice over and over. His most perceptive patients hadn't been destroyed by suppressing their gifts. They'd been training, learning to read human nature at levels most people never reach, developing strategic awareness while appearing harmless, building internal strength while everyone assumed they were weak. The hiding wasn't failure, it was becoming. Modern research has validated what Jung observed clinically. Dr. Elaine Aron's work on highly sensitive persons shows that roughly 20% of people have heightened sensory and emotional sensitivity. But Jung identified something more specific within his psychological typology. The introverted intuitive type, comprising roughly 1% of the population, who don't just feel deeply. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The alchemist's path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com, but perceive unconscious patterns with startling clarity. These individuals process not just obvious social cues, but unconscious emotional states, repressed content, and psychological patterns that others cannot detect. They see the depression behind forced smiles. They sense the desperation beneath confident presentations. They feel the collective shadow that groups unconsciously agree to ignore. And this ability becomes a burden when there's no framework to understand it as a gift. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the problem of the superior function, when your greatest strength becomes your greatest burden because it separates you from collective unconscious participation. You can't unknow what you know. You can't unfeel what you feel. You can't unsee what you see. So you either learn to integrate it consciously or you suffer from it unconsciously. There's no third option. The suffering shows up in predictable ways. You become the designated problem in every group you enter, not because you cause problems, but because you reveal problems that already exist in the collective unconscious. Jung called this the scapegoat phenomenon. The bearer of superior perception becomes the repository for all that the group cannot consciously acknowledge about itself. This pattern explains why these individuals don't just feel misunderstood. They feel systematically targeted by a force they can't rationally explain. And they're not wrong. When you see clearly what others need to deny, you become dangerous to their psychological defense systems. Not intentionally, just by existing. Your presence forces people to confront what they've spent years avoiding. And most people will attack the mirror before examining what's being reflected. Jung observed that people with highly differentiated perception see others' unconscious contents clearly often, because they're processing information at a different level of complexity. They're not trying to be judgmental or superior. Their nervous systems are simply wired to detect patterns that remain invisible to others. It's like having night vision in a world where everyone else can only see in daylight. You're not better. You're just seeing different wavelengths of reality. But here's what makes this ability so isolating. You can't share what you see because others literally cannot perceive it. You describe the emotional undercurrents in a room, and people look at you like you're speaking a foreign language. You point out obvious behavioral patterns and get accused of overanalyzing. You express concern about dynamics you can see forming and get told you're being paranoid. The curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it. This creates what Jung called participation mystique in reverse. Most people live in a state of merged consciousness with their environment, unconsciously absorbing and reflecting collective contents. But individuals with differentiated perception experience the opposite. They're psychologically separate, even when physically present. They observe the collective dance without being swept up in it. And this creates an existential loneliness that most people cannot comprehend. Jung understood this personally. During what he called his confrontation with the unconscious from 1913 to 1919, documented in the Red Book, he experienced overwhelming perception of unconscious contents, both his own and collective, that nearly destroyed him. He wrote that he was menaced by a psychosis and was saved only by his ability to understand what was happening through his work with patients. His superior perception almost killed him until he learned to integrate it consciously. This is why Jung considered the integration of superior perception not just therapeutically important, but psychologically urgent. Without proper integration, these individuals face three specific dangers. First, collective unconscious disruption. When someone sees through the shared illusions that hold groups together, they become a destabilizing force. Organizations, families, and societies function partly through collective unconscious agreements about what will and won't be acknowledged. The highly perceptive individual inadvertently violates these agreements simply by existing authentically. Second, psychological isolation. When your greatest psychological strength becomes the source of your greatest suffering, you face what Jung called the problem of the island. You become an island of awareness in an ocean of unconsciousness. This isolation isn't just social, it's existential. You're living in a different reality from everyone around you, and there's no bridge back to collective participation that doesn't require self-betrayal. Third, and most dangerously, identity dissolution. People who absorb unconscious contents from others often lose contact with their own authentic personality. They become so flooded with external psychological material that they can't distinguish between their own inner world and what they're absorbing from their environment. Jung called this participation mystique in its negative form, a state where psychological boundaries dissolve and the individual becomes merged with collective unconscious contents in a way that annihilates personal identity. This is the real danger Jung worried about. Not that gifted people would be rejected by society, but that they would lose themselves entirely in the process of trying to adapt to collective consciousness that cannot hold their level of perception. They would become psychological chameleons, shape-shifting to survive, until they forgot their original form completely. And then something shifted. Maybe someone betrayed you so deeply you couldn't pretend anymore. Maybe life got so painful that hiding hurt more than revealing. Maybe you just got tired of being small for people who would never grow big enough to meet you. Whatever the trigger, something inside you snapped, not broke, snapped awake. Jung called it the return of the repressed, the moment the hidden gift demands to be seen. This wasn't gradual. You didn't slowly become yourself again. You woke up one day and realized you were done explaining yourself to people who didn't want to understand, done shrinking to make others comfortable, done apologizing for seeing what they refused to look at. The pain of hiding finally exceeded the fear of being visible, and everything changed. People noticed. The ones who benefited from your smallness got uncomfortable. Family members who needed you to play a role got angry. Friends who liked you, diminished, got distant. They'd say you changed, that you weren't yourself anymore. Jung would tell you the opposite. You weren't yourself before. Now you finally are, and not everyone can handle that. Jung identified this as the individuation crisis, the moment when the psyche's demand for wholeness overrides the ego's need for social acceptance. It's not comfortable, it's not pretty, but it's necessary, because the alternative is psychological death, spending your entire life pretending to be someone you're not. And your psyche will not allow that forever. Eventually, it forces the choice: become who you are or suffer the consequences of self-betrayal. The gift you hid is coming back online, but it's not the raw, unintegrated perception you had as a child. It's refined, conscious, strategic. You don't just see patterns now, you understand them. You don't just feel energy, you know what to do with it. You don't just have intuition, you trust it completely. The hiding wasn't wasted time, it was integration training. Jung developed a three-phase process for integrating superior perception that he refined through decades of clinical work. Phase 1 is recognition and differentiation, learning to distinguish between authentic inner experience and unconsciously absorbed external content. He called this conscious discrimination, the ability to establish what belongs to you and what belongs to others. Without this discrimination, there can be no individual development. The technique is simple, but not easy. Spend time in complete solitude daily. Allow absorbed material to settle so you can recognize your own authentic psychological voice beneath the noise of others' projected contents. This isn't meditation or spiritual practice, it's psychological hygiene, creating space to sort your own feelings from everyone else's emotional debris. Phase 2 is shadow integration. Jung discovered that people who see others' shadows clearly often do so because they haven't integrated their own. The more you deny your own capacity for deception, selfishness, or cruelty, the more disturbed you'll be by seeing these qualities in others. Shadow integration means acknowledging that you contain every human quality you observe in others. This doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a complete person who can see clearly without judgment. Phase 3 is conscious participation, the ability to engage with others' psychological contents without being overwhelmed or losing your individual identity. Jung called this developing psychological containers, the capacity to hold others' unconscious contents temporarily while maintaining awareness that they are not your own. This is the difference between empathy and enmeshment, between perception and possession. Jung studied historical figures to understand the difference between successful integration and psychological breakdown. Consider the case of Nietzsche, a narrative illustration of unintegrated perception. Nietzsche possessed extraordinary insight into human nature and could see through social, religious, and philosophical facades with devastating clarity. But he never learned to integrate these insights constructively. Instead of using his perception in service of healing, he wielded it as a weapon against society. He remained identified with his superior function rather than integrating it into a balanced personality. His isolation and eventual breakdown represented what happens when superior perception remains unintegrated. Contrast this with Jung's analysis of Meister Eckhart, who he considered an example of successfully integrated superior perception. Eckhart possessed what Jung called mystical intuition, the ability to perceive spiritual and psychological realities that others could not access. But unlike Nietzsche, Eckhart channeled his insights into compassionate service. He transformed his superior perception into wisdom that could nourish others without overwhelming them. He saw clearly, but spoke in ways that invited understanding rather than resistance. His success came from what Jung called conscious humility, the recognition that superior perception is a gift to be shared wisely, not a weapon to be wielded. Jung knew what happens when gifted people finally stop hiding. They become what he called psychologically sovereign. Nobody can gaslight them because they trust their perceptions absolutely. Nobody can manipulate them because they see emotional games forming before they're fully played. Nobody can diminish them because they no longer need external validation for internal knowing. They become untouchable while remaining deeply human. This is why you're seeing this now. Not because you manifested it or because the universe decided it's your time, because you're ready. Your psyche knows the difference between someone who needs to keep hiding and someone who's prepared to be seen. You've done the work whether you knew it or not. You've built the internal structure to hold your own power. You've learned to be dangerous to those who would exploit you and safe for those who deserve your gifts. Jung emphasized finding what he called the few who understand, others capable of engaging with differentiated consciousness without defensiveness. In The Development of Personality, he wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, but this privilege cannot be realized in isolation. It requires witnessing by those capable of recognizing authenticity. He identified 3 essential types of relationships for the highly perceptive individual. First, fellow individuated persons, people who have done their own consciousness work and can meet you at your actual level. These connections often happen instantly and intensely. You recognize each other as members of what Jung called the conscious minority. These relationships are rare but essential for psychological survival. Second, those engaged in active individuation, people currently doing therapy, inner work, or spiritual practice, who may not possess superior perception themselves but understand its value. Jung observed that people who have begun to know themselves can bear to be known by others. They don't feel threatened by your ability to see clearly because they're committed to seeing themselves clearly. Third, natural containers. Individuals who, while not possessing superior perception themselves, have what Jung called natural container function, the ability to hold psychological content without being overwhelmed by it. These might be mature individuals who have weathered significant life challenges and developed the capacity to witness others' depth without collapsing into their own defensiveness. The world does need what you have, but not in the savior way people might have told you, not in the self-sacrificing way you might have believed. Jung was clear about this. Differentiated perception isn't a burden to carry for others. It's a gift to steward for yourself. You use it to build a life that honors your nature. You offer it to people who can receive it without trying to own it. You protect it fiercely from those who would drain it. Some will call this selfish. Let them. Jung knew that individuated people always get accused of selfishness by those who benefited from their self-abandonment. Your job isn't to make everyone comfortable with your emergence. Your job is to honor the gift that survived its own suppression long enough to be wielded with wisdom. That gift isn't for everyone. It's for you first. Then for those who have earned access to it through their own consciousness work. You'll recognize them. They won't be threatened by what you see. They'll be curious. They won't need you to diminish yourself. They'll celebrate your fullness. They won't exploit your perception. They'll reciprocate with their own depth. These are your people. Jung called them fellow travelers on the individuation path, and you'll find each other now that you've stopped hiding. The ones who can't handle you will remove themselves. Let them. Every person who leaves because you're too much is making room for someone who knows you're exactly enough. Every relationship that ends because you won't shrink anymore was built on a version of you that never truly existed. Every connection that can't survive your authenticity was never strong enough to deserve your energy. This isn't loss. This is liberation. Your gift wants to be used now, not performed, not proved, used. In the work you choose, in the relationships you build, in the life you design. You don't owe the world your light. You owe yourself the experience of living as who you actually are. That's the only offering that matters. When you stop hiding to please others, you start shining to please your own soul. And that kind of light doesn't just illuminate you, it shows others what's possible for them too. Jung spent his life studying people who see everything. He learned they either break under the weight of their perception or break through to something extraordinary. You're reading this because you chose breakthrough. Not consciously, maybe, but your psyche chose it. Your soul chose it. The part of you that survived the hiding chose it. And now the hiding is done. The preparation is complete. The gift is ready. And so, are you? This is your permission to take up space, to trust what you know, to honor what you feel, to use what you see, not recklessly, not carelessly, but consciously, strategically, powerfully. The gifted one who went into hiding is being called back, not to the world that rejected you, to the life that's been waiting for you to be brave enough to claim it. Jung believed that individuals who successfully integrate superior perception serve a vital evolutionary function. They see what collective consciousness is not yet ready to acknowledge, helping to prepare humanity for necessary developmental steps. In The Undiscovered Self, he wrote that the individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit, the one who brings about change in society. He believed that people with superior perception become what he called culture carriers. People who help consciousness evolve. You're not too much. You never were. You're exactly what consciousness looks like when it stops apologizing for being awake. The world needs your insights, but it needs them delivered with the integration, wisdom, and strategic awareness that transform dangerous perception into cultural medicine. Your gift is not your burden. Your unconscious relationship to your gift was your burden. Now you're learning to integrate it consciously, and that changes everything. If this resonated with something you've been feeling but couldn't name, you're not alone. There's a community of people who understand what it means to hide your gifts and what it takes to reclaim them. Like this video if you're ready to stop hiding. Subscribe if you're committed to conscious emergence. Share it with someone who needs permission to be seen. You were never meant to stay small. You were meant to learn to be big without breaking yourself or others. And now you know how. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.